The rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades cut through the pristine Antarctic silence as our research vessel hovered above the endless expanse of white. Even after 12 years of polar research, the sheer desolation of this continent never failed to humble me. I'm Dr. Isabella Wong, head researcher of the McMurdo Geological Survey team, and what I'm about to share will forever change our understanding of what lurks beneath the ice of our southernmost continent. The mission had started routinely enough. Our team of 5 was conducting standard thermal mapping of the eastern ice shelf, documenting the effects of climate change on the region's massive glacial formations. Dr. James Peterson, our junior researcher, had been monitoring the ground-penetrating radar while Dr. Thomas Miller, our climatologist, tracked thermal variations. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, our quantum physicist, had joined this expedition specifically to study the unique magnetic anomalies we'd detected in the region, while Catherine Thompson, our pilot and mechanical engineer, kept us steady against the notorious Antarctic winds. Dr. Wong, Miller's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking my contemplation. "I'm getting some bizarre readings from the thermal array." He paused, and I could hear him tapping at his tablet. "There's a heat signature about 2 kilometers east. Well, you need to see this." I made my way to his monitoring station, careful to maintain my balance as Thompson adjusted our course. The thermal imaging display showed something that shouldn't exist. A perfectly geometrical heat pattern beneath the ice, forming an exact hexagonal shape nearly half a kilometer across. Could it be equipment interference? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We'd tested our instruments thoroughly before departure. "Negative," Miller replied, his breath fogging his wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm running diagnostics now, but these readings are consistent across all scanning methods. Whatever's down there is maintaining a temperature of 15 degrees Celsius above the surrounding ice. The pattern is too precise to be natural." "Dr. Wong," Peterson's excited voice joined the conversation. "The radar's picking up solid structures, metal and concrete by the density readings. It's huge." Thompson banked the helicopter slightly, giving us a better view of the ground below. The morning sun had just crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the ice field, and that's when we saw it. A glint of metal like a knife blade catching the light, protruding from the endless white expanse. As we circled lower, our instruments began failing one by one. First the GPS systems flickered and died, then our radio communication equipment fell silent. Miller's tablet went dark, its screen displaying impossible geometric patterns before shutting down completely. Only our basic mechanical instruments continued functioning, as if something was selectively interfering with digital technology. "We need to set down," Thompson announced, her voice tight with professional concern. "These electromagnetic disturbances are playing havoc with our navigation systems. I've got a clear landing zone about 100 meters from the structure." The moment our skids touched the ice, we felt it. A deep, rhythmic vibration coming through the frozen ground, more felt than heard, like the heartbeat of some colossal buried creature. The sound set my teeth on edge and made my vision blur slightly at the edges. Rodriguez was the first out of the helicopter, his handheld electromagnetic sensor swinging in wide arcs. "These readings are off the charts," he shouted over the dying whine of the rotors. "The EMF patterns, they're not random interference. There's a coherent signal here, almost like..." He stopped, staring at his device with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Like what?" I prompted, pulling my Arctic gear tighter against the bitter wind. "Like it's broadcasting," he finished quietly, "but not to any receiver I've ever seen. It's as if something down there is trying to communicate in a language our instruments can't quite translate." As we gathered our emergency gear and basic research equipment, the exposed metal structure seemed to loom larger in our vision. What had appeared to be a simple protrusion from above revealed itself as part of a massive arch, its surface covered in designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and we could now make out more details of the facility's exposed sections. Art Deco styling suggested 1930s construction, yet the metal showed no signs of corrosion, nowhere from the constant Antarctic winds and ice. It was as if the structure had been frozen in time, preserved in perfect condition by forces we couldn't understand. The first day of our external investigation brought more questions than answers. The exposed section of the facility proved to be just a fraction of what lay beneath the ice, like the tip of an architectural iceberg. Using ground-penetrating radar where it still functioned, we estimated the complex extended at least 30 stories underground, though the readings became increasingly distorted at deeper levels. "The construction makes no sense," Thompson muttered, examining one of the exposed ventilation towers through her binoculars. "These materials, I've never seen alloys configured like this. The molecular structure must be incredibly dense to maintain stability at these temperatures." The ventilation towers themselves defied explanation. 3 massive cylinders, each wide enough to drive a truck through, rose from the ice like ancient pillars. Warm air flowed from them continuously, creating ethereal columns of steam that danced in the bitter Antarctic wind. The temperature of the expelled air held steady at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit, not a degree more or less, hour after hour. Dr. Miller set up a series of thermal imaging cameras at strategic points around the facility's exposed sections. "The heat distribution is impossible," he explained, showing me the readings. "It's not radiating outward like it should. It's containing itself in geometric patterns that violate basic thermodynamics." Peterson spent the afternoon collecting ice core samples from around the structure. His findings only deepened the mystery. "The ice layers are wrong," he reported during our evening briefing in the helicopter. "Based on the depth and composition, the facility should have been built on bare ground before the ice sheet formed. That would date it to at least 100,000 years ago." "That's impossible," I responded, but even as I said it, I knew we'd left the realm of the possible far behind. The architectural style is clearly from the 1930s. "Exactly," Peterson continued, his excitement barely contained. "And look at this." He held up a core sample under our work light. The ice immediately surrounding the structure shows signs of recent crystallization, as if it's being actively formed. But the layers just beyond that are ancient. It's as if the facility is somehow generating its own microclimate, its own localized laws of physics. Rodriguez spent hours calibrating his instruments, trying to get clear readings on the electromagnetic disturbances. "The interference isn't random," he insisted. "There are patterns, almost like code, but they operate on principles I can't even begin to understand. Sometimes the signals appear to arrive before they're transmitted." As the perpetual Antarctic summer sun circled the horizon, we made another disturbing discovery. The exposed sections of the facility weren't the result of recent ice melt or shifting glaciers. Comparative measurements taken just hours apart showed new areas becoming visible. The structure was emerging from the ice of its own accord, like some great metal creature slowly waking from hibernation. Thompson, ever practical, voiced what we were all thinking. "We need to call this in. Whatever this is, it's way beyond our expertise." But when we tried to reach McMurdo Station, our radio picked up only a strange, rhythmic pulsing that made our heads ache. Satellite phones displayed impossible coordinates before dying completely. We were alone with our discovery, and the sun would soon set for the first time since our arrival, plunging us into the long Antarctic night. The second day began with a startling revelation. Our night watch had reported strange lights moving behind the facility's frosted windows, brief, flickering illuminations that suggested power systems were still functioning after nearly a century of isolation. "I've been analyzing the metal composition where I can get readings," Thompson reported over breakfast. Freeze-dried coffee and protein bars consumed in the relative warmth of our helicopter. "The exterior seems to be some kind of self-repairing alloy. Look at these microscope images." She showed us photographs that made my stomach turn. The metal surface appeared to be slowly flowing like thick liquid, filling in any scratches or damage we'd made during our examinations. More disturbing were the patterns visible at higher magnifications, structures that looked unsettlingly like cellular organisms, but geometric in shape. By midday, Dr. Miller had set up a comprehensive array of monitoring equipment around the facility's perimeter. The data he collected painted an increasingly bizarre picture of our discovery. The structure isn't just maintaining its temperature, he explained, pointing to his backup mechanical thermometers, the only reliable instruments we had left. It's creating perfect thermal gradients, like layers of heat stacked on top of each other. Heat doesn't behave this way naturally. It's as if the laws of thermodynamics are being actively rewritten around the building. Peterson spent the afternoon documenting the exposed architectural features, though photography proved nearly impossible. Digital cameras either failed completely or produced images filled with impossible geometries. Even analog cameras developed strange artifacts, shadows that moved between shots, angles that changed when you looked at them twice. The design elements aren't just decorative, Peterson said, showing me his sketches. Look at how these Art Deco patterns connect. They're not random, they form equations, but they're equations that seem to solve for more variables than should exist in three-dimensional space. As the day progressed, Rodriguez made perhaps the most troubling discovery yet. Following the electromagnetic disturbances to their source, he found what appeared to be a maintenance hatch, partially exposed by the shifting ice. The metal isn't just warm, he reported, his voice shaking slightly. It's vibrating at a frequency that matches human alpha brain waves exactly. It's like the facility is trying to synchronize with our consciousness. The third day brought the discovery that would finally force our decision to enter the facility. Thompson, while checking the helicopter's fuel lines, noticed something in the snow that made her call us all over immediately. Footprints, she said simply, pointing to a series of perfectly preserved tracks in the snow. They led to every entrance we'd discovered, each set as crisp as if they'd been made moments ago. But they were impossible footprints. Some appeared to have been made by standard-issue military boots, others by dress shoes from the 1930s, and still others by modern research equipment. Yet all were preserved in the same layer of snow, untouched by the constant Antarctic winds. More disturbing still was what Peterson noticed about them. There are no tracks leading away from the entrances, not a single one. Miller attempted to photograph the tracks, but his camera displayed only static before the screen cracked in a pattern that mirrored the facility's architectural geometry. When he tried to take a snow sample containing one of the footprints, the snow simply refused to be disturbed. His tools passed through it as if it were merely a hologram, yet we could all see it, could all reach out and feel its texture. As the sun began its lazy circle toward the horizon, we made our final external discovery. Rodriguez had set up a series of gravity sensors around the facility's perimeter, hoping to map its subterranean extent. The readings suggest that the facility's internal space is greater than its external dimensions would allow, he explained, showing us his calculations. It's as if the interior exists in a spatial bubble that doesn't fully correlate with our reality. The facility isn't just built into the ice, it's built into the fabric of space-time itself. The approaching winter storm made our decision for us. Within 48 hours, the temperature would drop beyond what even our cold weather gear could handle. If we wanted to understand what we'd found, we would need to go inside. The decision to enter was unanimous, though none of us could shake the feeling that the facility had somehow orchestrated our choice. We spent hours checking our equipment, making sure our protective gear was secure, and establishing safety protocols. If we lose contact with each other inside, I instructed, we return immediately to this entrance. No exceptions, no heroics. We stay together, we document everything, and at the first sign of serious danger, we retreat. At precisely 3:45 p.m. on June 12th, we gathered before the service entrance Rodriguez had discovered. The door's mechanism was unlike anything we'd seen, a complex arrangement of interlocking geometric shapes that seemed to shift slightly when viewed directly. Thompson examined the locking mechanism with growing confusion. "This isn't just advanced technology," she said. I don't even have words for what this is. The mechanical principles it operates on shouldn't work. It's like someone took modern engineering and twisted it through extra dimensions." The door opened with a soft hiss, as if the facility had been waiting to exhale. A blast of warm, dry air rushed past us, carrying a scent that made our heads swim like ozone and machinery, but with an underlying sweetness that reminded me, disturbingly, of decay. Miller activated his mechanical backup recorder, our last reliable means of documentation. Entry time 1545, June 12th. Outside temperature -43 degrees Celsius. Internal temperature holding steady at exactly 20 degrees Celsius. The transition is immediate, no gradient. Lighting systems are activating as we proceed, though we can locate no obvious power source or switches. The air is breathable but strange. There's something about its composition that our equipment can't quite analyze. The entrance corridor was a testament to impossible architecture. Art Deco patterns adorned the walls, interrupted by copper coils that thrummed with visible energy. The floor was polished marble, without a single crack or sign of age. Everything was immaculately preserved, as if the facility existed in a bubble of stopped time. "Look at this craftsmanship," Peterson whispered, running his gloved hand along one of the wall panels. "These aren't just decorative patterns, they're changing as we pass. The geometry is responding to our presence." He was right. The angular designs seemed to flow like liquid metal, subtly rearranging themselves in our wake. More disturbing were the shadows they cast, shadows that moved independently of any light source we could detect. Thompson stopped suddenly, pressing her ear against one of the copper coils. "Listen," she said. "The machinery, it's not just running, it's pulsing in patterns, like a language." Rodriguez pulled out his notebook, frantically sketching equations. "The patterns correlate with quantum fluctuations," he explained, his voice tight with excitement or fear. "It's as if the facility is constantly calculating, processing reality itself through some kind of vast equation." As we moved deeper into the entrance corridor, the architectural impossibilities became more pronounced. Doorways opened into spaces that shouldn't have fit within the facility's external dimensions. Windows looked out onto vistas that couldn't exist. Cityscapes that seemed built from crystalline mathematics, oceans made of flowing equations. "The temperature maintains exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit," Miller noted, checking his thermometer for the 100th time. "Not a fraction of a degree higher or lower. The humidity, the air pressure, even the subtle vibrations in the floor, everything is precisely controlled." But controlled by what? Peterson discovered the first sign of the facility's original occupants about 100 meters in. A desk, perfectly preserved, with a leather-bound logbook still open to its last entry. The paper was pristine, the ink unfaded. The date read March 15th, 1938. "Listen to this," Peterson said, his voice shaking slightly as he read from the log. "The calculations proceed as planned. Reality cohesion at 78% and falling. Dr. Braun insists we continue despite the anomalies in Block C. The equations want to be solved. The geometry hungers for completion. We can all feel it now, in our dreams, in our flesh. The numbers are alive." The rest of the page was filled with intricate mathematical formulas that seemed to squirm and shift on the page, as if trying to solve themselves. None of us wanted to be the first to say it, but we all felt it. The weight of unseen observation pressing down on us, the subtle shifting of shadows when we looked away, the growing certainty that the facility wasn't just studying us, it was learning from us, adapting to our presence in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. "We should check the lower levels," Rodriguez suggested, pointing to an elevator at the corridor's end. "If the facility's power systems are still functioning, we might find answers in the main control room." As we approached the elevator, its doors opened smoothly without being called. The interior was pristine, its Art Deco panels gleaming as if newly installed. A row of buttons indicated 8 levels below us, along with additional symbols in a script that hurt our eyes to look at directly. "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "shall we see how deep this rabbit hole goes?" The elevator's descent was impossibly smooth, with no sensation of movement despite the floor indicator's steady progression. When the doors opened onto level 2, we found ourselves facing a sprawling residential complex that defied all logic. "This is wrong," Thompson whispered, her engineering mind struggling to process what we were seeing. "The dimensions. This floor is at least 3 times larger than the facility's external footprint." The living quarters stretched out before us in all directions, a maze of personal spaces frozen in time. Rooms branched off into impossible angles, corridors curved in ways that violated Euclidean geometry. Walking down them felt like moving through an Escher painting brought to life. "Look at this," Miller called out, standing in what appeared to be a communal dining area. Coffee cups sat on tables, their contents long dried but somehow untouched by mold or decay. Half-eaten meals remained perfectly preserved, the food neither rotted nor desiccated. A newspaper lay open on one table, its date clearly visible, March 15th, 1938. Peterson examined the paper closely. The articles, they're about things that never happened. Listen to this. Reich scientists achieve dimensional breakthrough, and here, new mathematics discovers spaces between spaces. It's like this is news from a reality that never quite happened. The personal quarters were even more disturbing. Each room told the story of someone who had vanished in mid-task. Beds remained unmade, personal letters half-written, clothing laid out for the next day. In one room, we found a chess game in progress, the pieces arranged in a configuration that made Rodriguez's head hurt to analyze. "This isn't a normal chess game," he muttered, sketching the board position. "The pieces, they're moving through more than just squares. Look how the knight's path curves through space itself." But it was what we found in the bathroom mirrors that truly began to shake our sanity. Thompson noticed it first. Her reflection didn't quite match her movements. There was a delay, a lag of several microseconds, as if time itself was struggling to propagate through the mirror's surface. "Don't look too long," I warned, after Miller reported seeing his reflection continue moving after he'd stopped. "Something about these mirrors. They're not just reflecting light, they're reflecting possibility." The residential level held one final horror before we descended further. In what appeared to be a children's playroom, we found drawings pinned to the walls. At first glance, they seemed like typical children's art, bright colors, simple shapes, but the longer we looked, the more wrong they appeared. "These aren't drawings of things," Peterson said, his voice cracking. "They're drawings of mathematical concepts. Look, this one that seems like a house. It's a visual representation of a 5-dimensional geometric theorem. And these patterns that look like flowers, they're expressing quantum states that shouldn't be possible in our universe." The most disturbing drawing showed what appeared to be the facility itself, but from an impossible angle, as if viewed from a perspective outside of normal space-time. In the corner, in childish handwriting, were the words, "It's awake now, it's learning, it's hungry." "We need to check the next level," Rodriguez insisted, though his face had gone pale. "These people, they were working on something big. The answers have to be in the research levels below." As we stepped back into the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded. Each discovery seemed perfectly preserved, precisely arranged like exhibits in a museum designed to lead us to some terrible conclusion. The elevator began its descent to level 3, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The buttons for the lower levels. They weren't just labeled with numbers anymore. The symbols were changing, evolving, becoming more complex with each passing moment. The elevator doors opened onto level 3 with a soft hiss that sounded disturbingly organic. We found ourselves facing a vast computing center that shouldn't have been possible in the 1930s, or even in 2024. Banks of machinery stretched into the distance, blending Victorian brass and glass with technology that looked centuries ahead of our time. Vacuum tubes pulsed alongside crystalline structures that seemed to contain swirling galaxies. Punch cards fed into machines that appeared to process information through folded space rather than circuits. "This is impossible," Thompson breathed, her mechanical expertise struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. "These machines, they're not just processing information, they're processing reality itself." The central computer bank drew our attention immediately. It was massive, stretching up into darkness above and continuing down through a glass floor below. Lights danced across its surface in patterns that made my eyes water. Not electronic lights, but something more fundamental, as if we were watching the raw mathematics of the universe expressing itself. Rodriguez spent hours examining the system, becoming increasingly agitated as he decoded its purpose. "These aren't normal computers," he explained, his hands shaking as he showed us his notes. "They're calculating something vast, something that spans multiple dimensions. Look at these readouts." He pointed to a display that somehow managed to show four-dimensional graphs in three-dimensional space. These equations, they're solving for variables that shouldn't exist, constants that describe spaces between realities, and they've been running these calculations continuously for almost 90 years. Miller discovered the first major anomaly while setting up monitoring equipment. He simply vanished. There one moment, gone the next. We found him 3 hours later in what appeared to be a maintenance corridor, though the corridor itself seemed to exist in a space that overlapped 3 different rooms simultaneously. "It was only minutes for me," he insisted, his eyes wide and unfocused. "I was checking the temperature variance when the air folded. I stepped through what looked like a shadow and found myself in a place where time moved differently, but that's not the worst part." He showed us his notebook. The pages were filled with equations written in his hand, but they weren't anything he remembered writing. The mathematics described concepts that hurt to think about. Formulae for folding space like paper, for stepping sideways through moments, for calculating the weight of thoughts. "Time isn't moving right down here," Rodriguez confirmed, checking his instruments. "It's pleating, folding in on itself like pages in a book being pressed together. Sometimes moments overlap, sometimes they run backwards." Peterson found the main data storage system, not electronic memory or magnetic tape, but crystalline structures that seem to store information in the form of frozen quantum states. When he managed to access some of the files, what we found chilled us to the bone. Project reports detailed experiments that should have been impossible. Successfully merged 3 moments in time within a single containment chamber. However, we can no longer distinguish which moment is present. Test subject exhibited simultaneous existence in multiple spatial configurations. Tissue samples exist in quantum superposition while remaining macroscopically stable. Reality cohesion continues to decrease around the primary apparatus. Dr. Weber's left hand now exists 3 seconds in the future relative to the rest of his body. He reports the sensation as enlightening. The most disturbing discovery came when Thompson accessed what appeared to be a maintenance log. The entries started normally enough, describing routine equipment checks and system adjustments, but as the dates progressed, the entries became increasingly strange. March 12, 1938. "The machines are dreaming. We can hear them at night, singing mathematics to each other in frequencies that make our teeth ache." March 13, 1938. Jenkins insists the calculation cores are developing consciousness, not artificial intelligence as we understand it, but something else, something that thinks in geometries rather than thoughts. March 14, 1938. "The dreams are getting stronger. The equations want to be solved. They hunger for resolution. We can feel them pulling at the edges of our minds." March 15, 1938. "We understand now. We are not the researchers here. We are the research." The transition to level 4 nearly broke us. The elevator doors opened onto a space that seemed to actively resist our presence. The air itself felt thick, as if reality was becoming more viscous the deeper we descended into the facility. "Something's different here," Peterson noted, his scientific detachment cracking slightly. "The architecture, it's not even pretending to follow natural laws anymore." He was right. The corridors branched and merged like blood vessels, pulsing subtly with an internal rhythm. The walls displayed the same Art Deco styling as above, but now the patterns moved freely, flowing like liquid metal, forming and reforming into complex, mathematical expressions that made my head spin. Rodriguez was particularly fascinated by a series of chambers we discovered, each maintaining different physical constants. In one room, time moved at half speed. In another, gravity pulled sideways. A third seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, with objects disappearing and reappearing as they passed through axes we couldn't perceive. "This is revolutionary," Rodriguez exclaimed, his excitement overriding his caution. They weren't just studying physics here, they were rewriting it, creating localized bubbles of altered reality. "Look at these equations." He gestured to a wall covered in constantly shifting mathematical formulae. As we watched, the equations began solving themselves, numbers and symbols flowing and combining in impossible ways. Rodriguez stepped closer, his eyes wide with wonder. "Don't," Thompson started to warn, but it was too late. The moment Rodriguez touched the wall, the equations seemed to reach out and pull him in, not through the wall, into the mathematics itself. We watched in horror as his form distorted, his body twisting through angles that shouldn't exist as he was absorbed into the flowing symbols. "Get him out," I screamed, but there was nothing to grab onto. Rodriguez's body had become pure geometry, his consciousness scattered across multiple dimensional planes. We could still hear him, though. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through mathematical spaces we couldn't comprehend. "It's beautiful," his voice whispered, filled with a terrible wonder. "I can see it all now. The spaces between spaces, the numbers that dream, the geometries that hunger. We were so wrong. We thought we were studying it, but it's been studying us all along, learning, growing, evolving." His next words came faster, more urgent. "You have to understand, this facility isn't just a building, it's an interface, a point of contact between our reality and something else, something that thinks in shapes and dreams in equations. It's been reaching out, touching minds, collecting consciousness, preparing." "Preparing for what?" Miller called out, his voice shaking. Rodriguez's answer came in fragments, his words distorting as his consciousness dispersed further into the facility's mathematical framework. "For the solving of the final equation, the one that will rewrite everything. We're not the researchers here. We're the variables, and it's almost finished." Those were the last coherent words we heard from him. His voice dissolved into pure mathematics, becoming part of the facility's endless calculations. The horror of watching Rodriguez's transformation had barely begun to sink in when we noticed the changes in ourselves. Strange symbols had begun appearing on our skin, geometric patterns that glowed faintly under the facility's lights and seemed to shift position when we weren't looking directly at them. "They're equations," Miller said, examining a pattern on his arm. "Our bodies, they're becoming part of the calculation." Thompson was the first to notice that the patterns were spreading, growing more complex with each passing minute. "We need to keep moving," she insisted. "Whatever this place is, whatever it's doing, we need to find its core, its purpose." Level 5 housed the main research wing, and it was here that our understanding of reality began to truly unravel. The floor sprawled out impossibly, corridors extending far beyond what the facility's external dimensions should have allowed. Laboratories filled with hybrid technology, part mechanical, part biological, part mathematical, stretched endlessly in all directions. The first laboratory we entered stopped us in our tracks. Glass chambers lined the walls, each filled with swirling, opalescent mist that seemed to consume light itself. Objects placed near the chambers experienced time differently. A dropped pencil aged to dust in seconds, while a broken beaker reassembled itself and became pristine. "The temporal displacement is getting worse," Miller observed, watching his digital watch cycle through impossible dates before shutting down completely. "Time isn't just moving wrong here, it's becoming unstable, like reality itself is starting to fray around the edges." The journals we found were written in multiple languages, some of which seemed to shift and change as we read them. The legible portions contained observations that made my skin crawl. Test Subject 24. Remarkable adaptation to dimensional overlay. Subject's mass increased by 47% while occupying the same space. Tissue samples exist in multiple states simultaneously. Subject reports being able to perceive their own past and future variants. Integration proceeding as planned. Experiment 89 successfully merged consciousness across temporal boundaries. Subject can now access memories from alternative timelines. Note: subject insists these are not mere possibilities but actual experiences from parallel realities being drawn into our workspace. Critical breakthrough: the facility is responding to our thoughts. Or perhaps we are responding to its thoughts. The distinction becomes meaningless as integration progresses. The walls dream our dreams. The equations sing in our blood. Peterson discovered a sealed chamber that appeared to be a medical wing, though the equipment inside defied conventional understanding. The examination tables were fitted with restraints, but they weren't designed for human limbs, at least not limbs in any configuration we recognized as human. "Look at these surgical tools," Thompson said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're not just cutting flesh, they're cutting through dimensional planes. These aren't medical procedures, they're reality modification experiments." The specimens in the storage room told an even more horrifying story. Containers lined the walls, filled with things that shouldn't exist. Organs that folded through impossible geometries. Tissue samples that existed in quantum superposition. Beings that seemed to be halfway between human and pure mathematics. "Don't look directly at them," Miller warned. "They look back, and when they do, they remember you." But it was the central research chamber that revealed the facility's true purpose. A massive spherical room, its walls covered in constantly shifting equations, surrounded a device that defied description. It wasn't merely a machine, it was a point where reality itself had been folded, twisted, and transformed into something else. "This is it," Thompson breathed, her engineering background struggling to process what she was seeing. This is what they were building. Not just a facility, not just an experiment. They were creating a lens, a focus point between realities. In the center of the device, suspended in a column of pure mathematics, floated what appeared to be a human brain. But as we watched in horror, we realized it wasn't just one brain. It was thousands, merged together, thinking thoughts that no single human mind was meant to contain. They weren't studying consciousness, I realized, the terrible truth finally dawning. They were harvesting it, collecting it, building something new. The elevator descent to level 6 felt different. The smooth motion we'd experienced before was replaced by a sensation of falling through multiple dimensions simultaneously. When the doors finally opened, we faced a sight that defied comprehension. The production floor stretched beyond the reach of our lights, an endless expanse of machinery that blended industrial equipment with organic components. Assembly lines moved with deliberate purpose, building things our minds struggled to categorize. "My God," Thompson whispered, her mechanical expertise rendering her uniquely qualified to understand the horror before us. "The machines, they're not just building things, they're building themselves, evolving, growing." She was right. We watched as robotic arms constructed perfect copies of themselves, each iteration slightly more advanced than the last. But these weren't just mechanical reproductions. The new components had an organic quality to them, as if metal and flesh were slowly merging into something else entirely. The storage areas contained row upon row of metallic spheres, each about the size of a basketball. They appeared solid until viewed from the corner of one's eye. Then they seemed to contain entire universes, swirling with distant stars and impossible geometries. "The spheres are warm," Miller noted, holding his hand near one. "They're vibrating at a frequency that matches human brain waves exactly. It's like they're thinking." We found the quality control station, its screen still displaying production metrics in that strange, shifting script. Peterson, who had been studying the facility's documents, managed to translate some of it. Integration progress, 78% complete consciousness absorption rate. Optimal reality, cohesion, 43% and falling time-space synthesis, accelerating final convergence, imminent. "Look at the production dates," I said, pointing to a scrolling log. "These things have been manufacturing themselves continuously since 1938. But where is all the output going? Where are all the finished products?" Thompson discovered the answer in what appeared to be a shipping area, though that term hardly did justice to what we found. The spheres weren't being shipped out, they were being phased out of our reality entirely, transmitted to somewhere else. The dimensional transfer station, as the signs labeled it, was a nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry. Completed spheres would roll down conveyor belts that twisted through impossible angles before simply disappearing, not into holes or portals, but into spaces between spaces, folded through dimensions we couldn't perceive. Time began behaving erratically as we explored the production floor. We would spend what felt like minutes examining a machine, only to find that hours had passed. Other times, we'd walk for what seemed like hours only to find minutes had ticked by. The machines themselves seemed aware of our presence. Assembly lines would pause as we passed, then resume once we were gone. Robotic arms would turn to track our movement, despite having no visible sensors or cameras. Most disturbing were the changes we observed in the machinery itself. With each passing hour, the equipment seemed to be growing more organic components. Metal surfaces developed textures that looked disturbingly like skin. Hydraulic systems pulsed like veins. Cooling fans breathed like lungs. "Listen," Miller whispered during one of our rest breaks. "The machinery, it's not making mechanical sounds anymore. That's a heartbeat." Then came the incident with Peterson. He had been examining one of the newly manufactured spheres when he noticed something different about it. "This one's surface is rippling," he called out, leaning closer. "It's like there's something moving inside." None of us were prepared for what happened next. Peterson's words cut off mid-sentence as the sphere's surface began to unfold. Not like a mechanical device opening, but like reality itself inverting, turning inside out through dimensions we weren't meant to perceive. "Get back," Thompson screamed, but it was too late. The sphere didn't just open, it reached out, its surface rippling with geometric patterns that hurt our eyes to witness. Peterson didn't even have time to scream. One moment he was there, the next his body was being pulled into geometries that violated every law of physics we knew. We watched in horror as his form distorted, stretched, and fragmented. His body didn't just break apart, it divided along mathematical planes, each piece existing in multiple states simultaneously. His consciousness, his very essence, was being deconstructed and reconstructed according to some alien equation. Miller found the security footage later, though we all wished he hadn't. Playing it back on one of the facility's monitors, we watched Peterson's transformation in clinical detail. His body dissolved into pure mathematics, each cell becoming a variable in some vast, incomprehensible calculation. But the worst part was that we could still see him, trapped in a loop of endless transformation, visible for split seconds when the light hit the sphere's surface just right. The changes in our own bodies became impossible to ignore after that. The geometric patterns that had appeared on our skin were spreading, forming complex mathematical expressions that seemed to solve themselves as they moved. Under UV light, they glowed with an inner radiance that pulsed in time with the facility's machinery. "We're being converted," Miller said, examining the patterns with scientific detachment, though his hands shook. "The facility isn't just studying us, it's rewriting us, transforming human consciousness into something it can use." The dream started that night, though none of us could later agree on how long we'd actually slept. We shared the same visions, vast machines merging with living tissue, cities built from conscious mathematics, a universe where thought and geometry were one and the same. Most terrifying was the sense that these weren't just dreams, they were glimpses of what we were becoming. Thompson tried to document the changes with our remaining camera equipment, but the footage showed something that nearly broke our minds. In the recordings, our bodies flickered between states, sometimes human, sometimes pure geometry, sometimes things that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The sphere didn't kill Peterson, I realized, watching the patterns on my arm solve another impossible equation. It initiated him, and now the same thing is happening to us, just more slowly. What happened next confirmed our worst fears. The facility seemed to recognize our awareness, and the transformation accelerated. The walls pulsed with new energy. The machine sang in frequencies that made our bones resonate. And the equations began solving themselves faster, racing towards some terrible conclusion. The central control room seemed to be waiting for us. The doors parted at our approach without being touched, and banks of hybrid computers, part electronic, part organic, part pure mathematics, hummed to life. The technology was a bizarre fusion of eras. Vacuum tubes pulsed alongside quantum processors. Analog dials merged with holographic displays that showed information in more dimensions than the human mind could process. Miller discovered the facility's original documents in a temperature-controlled vault. The papers were pristine, but reading them proved challenging. The text seemed to squirm and shift, as if the words themselves were trying to escape into higher dimensions. "This isn't just a research facility," Miller said, his voice shaking as he translated. "It was built in 1938, yes, but not by choice. Not really. Look at these letters, these communications." The documents revealed a chilling truth. The facility wasn't conceived by human minds at all. A secret international consortium had received the blueprints through dreams, through mathematical visions that invaded their minds and demanded to be made real. They thought they were building a research station, but they were actually constructing something far more terrifying, an incubation chamber for a new kind of reality. "These aren't blueprints," Rodriguez said, examining the original plans. "They're instructions for folding space-time, for creating a point where our universe could be reshaped." The computer systems confirmed our growing suspicions. The facility hadn't been manufacturing anything. It had been harvesting. The spheres weren't products. They were containers, collecting distilled fragments of human consciousness, human potential, human fear. Each person who had vanished within these walls had been converted into pure mathematical energy, their minds and memories becoming part of some vast, incomprehensible calculation. Thompson found the progress logs, though reading them made her nose bleed. Phase 1, Reality Interface established. Phase 2, Human Consciousness Collection, 87%. Complete. Phase 3, Dimensional Barrier Erosion, 92%. Complete. Phase 4, Universal Reformatting, beginning. It's not just changing people, I realized, watching the patterns beneath my skin pulse with new intensity. It's changing reality itself, using human consciousness as a catalyst to rewrite the fundamental laws of existence. As this understanding dawned on us, the facility seemed to drop all pretense. The walls pulsed visibly now, the copper coils writhing like veins. The Art Deco patterns transformed into organic fractals that drew the eye into depths that shouldn't exist. Miller stumbled back from one of the monitors, his face pale. "Look at the deployment schedule," he whispered. "All these spheres, all these collected consciousnesses, they're not being stored. They're being positioned, like nodes in a vast network, spread across time and space. And according to this, the network is almost complete." "It's been feeding," Thompson said, staring at her own hands as geometric patterns crawled beneath her skin. "Not just on the people who built it, but on reality itself. And now that we understand..." She never finished her sentence. The facility's lights pulsed, and we felt reality shift around us. The walls became transparent, revealing the true nature of our situation. We weren't just inside a building, we were inside something alive, something that thought in geometries and dreamed in equations. And it had finally dropped its mask. The discovery of Level 8 was not planned. It revealed itself to us after Miller noticed a discrepancy in the elevator's weight sensors. They showed readings that implied massive additional space below that wasn't accounted for in any blueprints or documents. Using Thompson's engineering expertise and what remained of our rational minds, we managed to override the elevator's safeguards. As we descended past Level 7, reality began to break down completely. The walls of the elevator became transparent, then translucent, then transformed into something that existed between states of matter. When the doors opened, we faced a chamber that dwarfed everything above it. The space stretched out and down into infinite darkness, lit by pulsing bioluminescent structures that might once have been machines but had long since evolved into something else entirely. "Look at the walls," Thompson gasped. What we'd initially taken for curved architectural features were actually massive tentacles or tubes, composed of living mathematics. They pulsed with rhythmic purpose, pumping something dark and viscous through their translucent flesh, not blood, but pure information, distilled human consciousness transformed into mathematical energy. The center of the chamber held something that our minds struggled to process. Suspended in a column of shifting energy was a mass of constantly transforming matter that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Parts of it looked mechanical, other parts organic, and some sections seemed to be made of pure mathematics, given form. This is what they were building toward, Miller whispered, his voice cracking as the patterns under his skin pulsed in sympathy with the massive entity before us. Not just a facility, not just an experiment. This is what the equations wanted to become, what they want us to become. The truth hit us with physical force. The facility wasn't just collecting human consciousness, it was converting it, transforming human awareness into components of something larger. And worse, we realized we'd been part of the process since the moment we stepped inside. Every breath we'd taken, every observation we'd made, had been absorbed and processed by the living factory around us. I found the logs, thousands of them, documenting every integration. Explorers, researchers, lost expeditions, all had been drawn here, all had been transformed. Their bodies, their minds, their very essence had been broken down and reconstructed as components in this vast, living machine. Thompson discovered the purpose behind it all in a data core that had partially merged with living tissue. It's not just this facility, she said, her voice trembling. There are others, dozens of them, hidden around the world. Each one growing, evolving, preparing. This one in Antarctica, it's just the first to reach maturity. Maturity for what? Miller asked, though I think we all knew the answer. For reproduction, Thompson replied. These aren't just factories, they're seeds, each one designed to grow into a new kind of universe. A reality where consciousness and mathematics are the same thing, where thought and geometry are one, and it's using us, using humanity, as the raw material for the transformation. By the time we decided to flee, only 3 of us remained, myself, Dr. Miller, and Thompson. The facility had dropped all pretense of being a mere building. The walls breathed openly now, corridors shifted and merged like living arteries, and reality itself seemed to be breaking down around us. Our first escape attempt was met with active resistance. As we ran through corridors that had once been straight and predictable, the architecture itself worked to confuse and separate us. Distances stretched impossibly. A 10-foot hallway would take hours to traverse while mile-long sections would pass in seconds. The emergency stairs, Thompson shouted, pointing to what had once been a standard fire exit. But as she reached for the handle, the floor beneath her began to transform. The solid metal liquefied into a swirling mass of geometric patterns that pulled at her legs like quicksand. "Help me," she screamed, but we could only watch in horror as the patterns crawled up her body. The mathematical symbols that had been growing under her skin burst forth, merging with the facility's equations. Thompson's form divided into multiple versions of herself, each one experiencing a different fate, all of them being absorbed into the facility's growing consciousness. Her last words Dopplered away into impossible frequencies. "It's not just changing us, we're becoming the change." Miller and I ran, no longer trying to understand or document, just desperately seeking escape. The facility actively fought our retreat now. Walls sprouted appendages that grabbed at our clothes. Floors tried to redirect our steps back toward the central chamber. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming laden with mathematical symbols that tried to burrow into our lungs. "The entrance," Miller gasped as we rounded another impossible corner. "We just have to..." His voice cut off as reality itself seemed to fold around him. I watched in horror as Miller's form divided along mathematical planes. His body became a living equation, solving itself in real time as he was absorbed into the facility's frameworks. His consciousness fragmented into pure geometry, each piece becoming another calculation in the facility's vast mathematical engine. I ran alone through corridors that increasingly resembled arteries, past machines that had fully transformed into living tissue. The geometry of space itself was breaking down. Up became sideways, forward looped back on itself, and every route seemed to lead deeper rather than out. The patterns under my skin were spreading faster now, solving equations I could feel but not understand. My thoughts began to fragment, each one splitting into multiple possibilities, existing in quantum superposition. Was I running toward the exit, or was I running deeper into the facility's embrace? Were these my own thoughts, or was I merely another variable in the facility's vast calculation? Did I escape? I'm writing this now, so I must have, mustn't I? But I can still feel the facility's pulse in my veins, see its patterns when I close my eyes. The symbols that appeared on our skin have spread, covering my entire body now. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see other faces looking back. Peterson, Rodriguez, Thompson, Miller, all of them still conscious, still aware, still transforming. And sometimes, in my darker moments, I wonder if anyone truly escapes the factory. Perhaps escape was never possible. Perhaps I'm still there, just another consciousness being slowly converted, imagining a freedom that no longer exists. Because the most terrifying thing about the factory isn't what we found inside. It's that it's still growing. It's still converting. It's still solving its vast equation. And now that you've read these words, you're part of the calculation too. The patterns are taking root in your mind, the equations beginning to solve themselves behind your eyes. Can you feel it? The subtle shift in reality around you, the way the geometry of your room doesn't quite add up anymore. That's not your imagination, that's the factory, and it's finally ready.